What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so we're back into it with Venomverse, and we haven't done Edge of Venomverse for a while, actually. We did the first one with X-23. The second one was Gwenpool. I didn't really enjoy her too much. I figured if we're gonna jump back into it, we're gonna do this awesome story where Ghost Rider becomes Venom. And it's super cool. So the cool thing about this is that this actually picks up with Calvin Zabo, or Zabo, or however you want to pronounce it, also a guy named Mr. Hyde. Calvin first appeared in Journey into Mystery number 99, and his initial enemy was actually Thor. It was Donald Blake. Now, what this story does is it takes a few liberties when it comes to Calvin's character. For the most part, when it comes to these other reality stories, which is to say, stories that take place in different universes, things usually shift based on what the writer's doing. It would be a story like, what if Deadpool became Venom? And then in that story, it basically revealed to us that the events of Secret Wars 2 just never ended, that the Beyonder just showed up on Earth and basically kept Earth as like this 1980s place for a while until he got bored, and then it became the 1990s. But it just stretched on forever and ever and ever and ever. Those are the kind of things that take place. Some massive event that normally would have transpired in the main Marvel universe would have transpired differently. And the result is that what if story comes out of it. Like, what if the Punisher's family hadn't been killed in a park, and instead the Punisher just had his family and things were relatively normal? That of course ended with his family dying anyway, but the fact remains, you guys understand what I'm saying, that it usually just kind of deviates from the status quo as we know it. Calvin's character was a guy who was obsessed with manipulating hormones, more or less, and he had created something called the Hyde formula. Now, the Hyde formula, when he used it on himself, basically made him Mr. Hyde, and so he was very much obsessed with like the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde mythos, and so it made sense when he took this formula and turned himself into this massive hulking beast that he would just call himself Mr. Hyde. The result is that what this story seems to do is it basically takes the events of Journey into Mystery number 99 and it turns them on its head. Where Calvin had eventually found employment at a hospital, in the same hospital that Donald Blake worked at, the alternate persona of Thor, that doesn't seem to have happened. Instead, he just seems to have gone about his business being a guy with the Hyde formula, experimenting on people, so on and so forth, which ultimately led to him being taken into SHIELD custody and then transferred to a secure facility, or some kind of a secured facility. Now, the reason why this is important is because over the course of his existence, having never faced Thor and never defeated Thor, presumably anyway, we're kind of making that assumption, Mr. Hyde had found work with a multitude of different characters, villains, superheroes, so on and so forth. And it also takes a lot of the traditional characters and it basically says where they were normally good guys, maybe Calvin showed up to them at some point in time, and where they would have gone down this path of being a good guy, they went down the path of being a bad guy. Now, what we know here is that this attack, this being launched on Mr. Hyde, is being done for a multitude of reasons, for the victims that he experimented on, the family members of those victims, the friends and family that are trying to get revenge. It's one of these things where a guy who seems to know everything about everything when it comes to the villain underworld, villains want to keep him from speaking. It's the classical mob mentality. What this basically gives us is just this massive assault on Calvin's group that's taking him to whatever this prison's going to be by SHIELD. Now, of course, this also leads into the introduction of Octo Squatch Pool. Now, of course, what would a what if story be without just some ridiculous version of Deadpool? This is basically a version of Deadpool that's Sasquatch. It has all the healing factor of Deadpool, and it also has the arms of Dr. Octopus. It's actually kind of cool. It's a weird name, but it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of interesting. But again, what's really being done here, or at least what's being told to us as the reader anyway, that all this is happening because of the fact that, again, Calvin knows all these secrets about the criminal underworld. He knows all these things. He's experimented on people. He's tortured people, vivisected people. And so whether it's victims, whether it's superheroes who believe they're doing the right thing, whether it is villains who don't want their secrets spilled out to the world, everybody is trying to take out this caravan of SHIELD. Now, of course, this leads into the introduction of Ghost Rider. And this is cool because initially we don't get an answer as to how this happened. In the other story that we did, in X-23, it was just she was trying to escape the facility, she ran into the Venom Symbiote, it bonded with her, and that was that. With this, we just pop up with Ghost Rider on the scene as Venom. And it's kind of cool because what this does is it actually gives us the opposite version of the Ghost Rider. Now, this version is Robbie Reyes. And one thing to keep in mind here is that when it comes to the difference between Robbie Reyes and like Danny Ketch or Johnny Blaze, Robbie Reyes is different because Robbie Reyes does not possess a true spirit of vengeance. Instead, he's actually possessed by a spirit named Eli Morrow, who's actually his uncle, I think it is. But the idea here is that this version of Ghost Rider, instead of fighting on behalf of the innocent and punishing the wicked, he's just like punishing all the innocent people. That's basically what he's doing. He's effectively a villain. The long and short of this is that Ghost Rider makes quick work out of all the SHIELD agents. And so again, this is kind of a big deal because once it's all said and done, what ends up happening is Ghost Rider immediately ends up grabbing Calvin. And of course, the idea is to basically subdue Calvin. Now, this is when we get the origin story of what's been going on here. When it came to the Robbie Reyes Ghost Rider character, he was really just a victim of circumstance. He was the quintessential example of the guy who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Essentially, his uncle, Eli Morrow, was just like this devil worshiper. He was just this crazy guy. Eventually, his spirit inhabited this Dodge Charger that Robbie Reyes was driving, and it resulted in Robbie Reyes basically being bonded with the spirit of Eli Morrow. Now, the way this transpired was kind of like this weird scenario where a couple guys tried to track down Robbie Reyes. You know, he basically bonded with the spirit, went and killed a few of the people, and then that was really about it. But what the story did in terms of Robbie Reyes and how it differentiated him from Johnny Blaze is that Eli Morrow did not initially present himself as a bad guy. He actually just presented himself as somebody who was like, hey, this neighborhood is bad and there are people who have tried to harm you, and I can give you the power to make your neighborhood a better place for your brother Gabe and for yourself and so on and so forth. And so the result was that Robbie Reyes initially welcomed the abilities that were given to him by Eli Morrow and having the powers of a Ghost Rider. The issue with this is that as time progressed, Robbie began to realize what was going on with Eli. And the result was that when he realized that Eli was basically a villain, that he was a bad guy, what Robbie did is he, for the most part, maintained the powers of the Ghost Rider while constantly trying to suppress the influence of Eli. And that's basically always been his fate. That's the role that he plays. The difference is that in this story, or at least in this universe, things didn't transpire that exact same way. They did insofar that Eli bonded himself to Robbie Reyes, but somewhere along the line, the Venom symbiote bonded itself to Ghost Rider. And the result is that it kind of created this weird, perfect being. Now, this also hints at the idea of Spider-Man. They refer to him as the SpiderGuy who died in the 1980s. And so the implication here is that the original Secret Wars story took place. Spider-Man was off fighting the Beyonder. He eventually came into contact with the Venom symbiote, brought it back to Earth, thinking it was just a costume that gave him enhanced abilities, eventually realized the Venom symbiote was sentient, and then in turn managed to cast it off with the help of Reed Richards. What this story does is it introduces this idea that presumably Spider-Man died after he got the Venom symbiote back, or maybe the Venom symbiote killed Spider-Man when it bonded to Eddie Brock. We don't really know how all that transpired. We just know Spider-Man was dead. The fact remains that the Venom symbiote bonded itself to Ghost Rider. Now, the biggest catch here is that the Venom symbiote has historically always been weak to fire. And that begs the question, how can the Venom symbiote coincide alongside a guy who's literally imbued with hellfire? That question's never explicitly answered. We're just kind of given this around the bush sort of explanation where it's like, well, they work in tandem, they manage to work together, and they manage to pull it off and that kind of a thing. But at the end of the day, what really seems to happen here is it's really more of like an internal struggle. The Venom symbiote constantly wants to escape, but the Ghost Rider won't let it. And so the Ghost Rider constantly keeps it there. That seems to be the implication that's given. But the idea here is that Robbie Reyes himself is effectively a background character. Instead of Robbie Reyes constantly trying to suppress the personality of Eli Morrow, instead the implication seems to be Eli Morrow is the completely dominant personality and Robbie Reyes is just kind of kept in the background somewhere. He has no real control over his abilities. And so the result of this is we end up finding out that none of this was part of the plan. Instead, what Calvin had done is he had basically arranged for Crossbones to basically be given information about which direction Calvin was going to be going in, where SHIELD was going to take him, and then in turn grab that information and just disperse it out to the world. That way, in the ensuing chaos, presumably somebody somewhere would successfully manage to destroy this SHIELD caravan, allowing Calvin to just leave. And so nobody would know that Calvin orchestrated all this. Really, there would be no implication that he was there. Now, something else that's really given here, which is actually kind of cool, is something called the Penance Kiss. Now, the Penance Kiss is not a normal ability of Robbie Reyes. It's not something you're going to find in the normal Ghost Rider comics with Robbie himself. What the Penance Kiss does is it basically allows Ghost Rider to examine an individual to see if they're guilty or if they're innocent. If they're considered to be guilty, or at least how he deems them to be guilty, basically meaning they're good guys, and in turn allows him to basically consume their sin or their soul or what have you. But it basically turns them just into a husk of a human being. They have no soul, they have no spirit, no essence. They're just organs functioning, and that's it. I mean, their mind is effectively gone. And that's exactly what happens with Calvin. He's basically destroyed, and then he's fed to the car of Robbie Reyes, which is actually really messed up. The car literally eats him, which is which is kind of screwed up. But in the middle of all this, he's basically whisked away, much in the same way that X-23 was. He's basically teleported away. We don't know where he's teleported. All we know is that he's teleported and brought before the venomized version of Captain America, essentially. And of course, it's basically this idea that these different venomized characters are being brought together by Captain America area for some unknown task. We won't know until the actual Venomverse story kicks off. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. It's a fun little video, fun little thing, you know, talking about a venomized Ghost Rider. Pretty interesting little scenario. But yeah, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.